We just want to introduce our speakers. Happy to introduce Dr. Anton Chuvakin and Iman Ghanizada. So go ahead and take it away.
All right, we're here. Anton, yeah, great.
Here we are.
Great to see everyone. My name is Iman Ghanizada. Anton, off to you.
Well, it's one of our favorite topics. So my name is Anton Chuvakin. I work for Office of the CISO. Ultimately, I work for Phil. And Phil has the credit for the name. So if you want to blame us for the Autonomic, blame Phil.
Yeah, blame Phil. Yeah, we had a much cooler name before it became Autonomic. I can't share it now. But so, anyways, today, well, it's great to see you all. So we did a session a couple weeks ago in Sunnyvale, and it was actually pretty funny because I came out on stage and we were so excited. It was like an internal Google session, and we had 800 people. And 780 of them were virtual. So I know this audience isn't fully jam-packed. I thought we were going to be in the main room. So like when I make jokes, we got to try to laugh, even if it's not funny. Yeah, okay. So today we're going to keep this lighthearted. We're going to keep it pretty fun. This actually was from a webinar we did with a couple funny guys. Okay, so. That's Eric Foster. He was the founder, CEO, former CEO of Sideris, one of our large partners here at Google Cloud. And that's a Canadian businessman, Robert Herjavec. He's a
From his boat, by the way.
Yeah, from his boat.
From his boat. This is not a joke, which blew our minds a few times over, but yes, from his boat.
He had his yacht delivered to the Bahamas and dialed in from his yacht and showed us the background of the waves just going by.
Which made us cry, naturally. Yeah. His internet was faster than what I had in theyre. Yeah. Just don't go there, Iman.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about what ASO is, and we're gonna try to be brief. It's a 45-minute session, but we're still gonna try to be brief, hopefully. And hopefully by the end of this, we'll leave everyone with a lot more general confusion than when you came in.
And some answers too, by the way.
Yeah. Okay, Anton, tell us about the actual.
On a more serious note. A slightly more serious note. We want to talk about some of the things that mix our experiences in the field dealing with SOCs, and of course some of the Google lessons. The inspiration for this whole ASO movement and ideas came from the fact that a lot of people come to Google and say, hey Google, tell us how you do security operations. And we tell them, well, we can tell you, but we're not sure you can replicate all that because you're not us. But what's the way to make some of the lessons learned here at Google and marry it with what we see in the field, what we've seen in the field over the years, what you experienced at previous jobs, and also mix it with lessons from the other revolution that affected IT, DevOps, SRE. And so ASO is kind of the merger of all those. So we're going to talk about some of this. We're going to talk about the principles, and we'll try to give you a bit of a framework for operationalizing it in the real world. So that's the intent. We may not fit in 45 minutes. Some of the stuff can last for hours and days. I don't know, maybe days.
Yeah.
But we'll give you some of the key ideas and highlight them that you can use at home and at your work. Maybe not at home.
Yeah.
Okay.
We've done like 5-minute stories, 20-minute pitches, 45-minute.
We did hours of this.
90-minute and 2-day-long workshops. So we can go all over the place. Okay, so a couple first things we'll talk about is sort of some of the high-level high-level board metrics to consider or questions to ask if you're a CISO. The questions we're hoping people are going to ask us in the modern day of security operations is centered around efficiency, like how we can improve the efficiency, because we all know the alert fatigue problem is not something that we can solve with more people. The efficacy problem, this is interesting because historically efficacy has been binary. Did we get breached by a 17-year-old? Did we not get breached by a 17-year-old? So like, how can we actually bring security to a place where we can measurably understand if we're actually improving the effectiveness of our security operations program? Managing costs, because for a company like Google, all those costs are abstracted from us, but for customers, they got to pay for, massive SIM deals and so on and so forth. And then also the workforce sustainability piece is a really important one, especially in the state of affairs with SOCs today. I'm sure everyone who's been around a SOC or worked in a security operations practice, we're all familiar with this challenge. But the question we actually get is, how do we do what Google does? Like 10 times out of 10, customers say, I want to do what Google does. And so what they're expecting is they're expecting this. They're expecting I bring Anton Chuvakin alongside Tim, Wynn, and Joachim, and all the folks that run Google's internal security practice, and Michael's secret stuff. Yeah, that's from Space Jam.
And occasionally I stop them and say, okay, I can tell you right away. First, hire about 800 engineers who are like literally the best on the planet. Step two.
Make them all take coding exams.
Yeah, well, step two, and at this point we like lost 99.999% of the audience. The point is that this is, the ASO is our attempt to distill some of the lessons, mix it up with what we see outside, and make it useful.
Yeah, yeah. So
not in a can. Yeah, if you have
exactly. And so like, let's kind of bucket those same questions that we asked earlier into what does Google do and what do most enterprises do, right? And so this is the efficiency challenge, the talent shortage, burnout, expensive, efficacy. I call these the 5 E's. That was supposed to be like employee shortage, employee burnout, whatever. Anyways, so from an efficiency standpoint, this is a big challenge that I think a lot of security practices are starting to understand today, which is, how do we use tools like SOAR? How do we drive automation culture? How do we do a better job of making people do more with less? And actually, Anton and I wrote a white paper, the 10x transformation.
The original ASO paper.
ASO paper, yeah. And we talked about this concept of like, there's just never going to be enough people. So we have to find ways to make people be able to, drive a 10x improvement across a couple core domains, which we'll dive into today. But for Google, like automation is part of our hiring process. It's part of our OKRs for how we benchmark teams. It's part of performance reviews for our engineers. We also hire engineers, right? Versus like traditional SOCs, have these linear, job functions, job structures, tier 1, 2, 3, content creation, so on and so forth. And for a lot of customers we've talked to, they're, now buying SOAR, and it's really tough to operationalize this because there's just generally a minimal automation culture in place, except for like the cloud natives, which are doing security from an engineering standpoint. Think of like Netflix and Facebook, so on and so forth. The talent shortage piece, again, for us, like we get to beat Google, so we get to hire Google engineers and everything else. We pay a lot, obviously, blah, blah, blah. Legacy SOCs hire traditional roles. There's no coding interviews, and you can't suddenly go and be like, you know what, we're going to require coding interviews for all of our security operations, future hiring staff, because there's just not enough security operations people that also know code. And also, when you're using commercial tools, oftentimes you don't have to know code to use commercial tools. It's very technical, but in another context. Okay, the burnout problem for us, we've been able to get to this place of having a 40-40-20 split between engineering, between operations, and between learning, right? But for most people, we already know utilization is always
110% operations
200%.
Would be a reasonable, or 200 if you're stressed.
Yeah.
But this is one of the ideas that would be visible throughout the presentation that we pretty much stole from the site reliability engineering and DevOps, where they are kind of forced, if they are involved with, like forget security, with IT aspects, running the systems, how do you make half of the time responding to alerts and signals and what would later define as toil, and the other half being actually engineering stuff? And this has happened in IT, and we are trying to drag it into SOC, and of course in a normal SOC, it's 110% responding to things, right? And people think, well, that's kind of the point. And we are telling them, hold on, if that's the point, you may not like how the future looks in your company. It's kind of like I'm giving you a bit of a preview, but...
Walk us through efficacy, because that's like an important one that's kind of new, right?
Yeah, we'll share some of the magic that we built in this area, but the idea is that I still see SOCs where the processes are kind of very rigid and they're built by a consultant in the beginning of a SOC, and then people just follow the Visios flowcharts. And in that sense, there's almost no feedback loop. And I don't want to quote Kevin Mandy and Phil with OODA, but the point is that there's no OODA. There's just basically build something decent in the beginning and sort of follow up. And then if you got it right, you get a mediocre SOC. If you get it wrong, you have no SOC. It blows up. We're trying to figure out how to build the feedback loops into everything, and we'll show you some of the examples of that. So to me, efficacy isn't like, oh, we have the secret for the right process that we can give you on a Visio or on a Google Draw visual. I don't know.
Yeah.
The point is that it's going to be a loop that would work.
Yeah, and I would say probably just to add on to that, if you think about like any conference you go to, even here, you go to the expo hall, and there's a bunch of different tools, and it's a whole, SOC teams operate in a heterogeneous environment. We have to leverage a bunch of different technologies and somehow make sense of all of them. But if you notice, what a lot of companies do is they've got like 1 or 2 CTI people that work with threat intelligence. They've got a bunch of tier 1 analysts. They've got a couple people spread out all over here. And how do we actually bring all of these different capabilities, different investments, and also different roles into a model where we can actually prove that, hey, you know what, we actually believe that we're measurably a more effective security operations program today than we were, when we had a traditional SOC, siloed, so on and so forth. Okay, cool. So let's actually go into, okay, Anton, off to you.
So the reason why, one of the other kind of pillars/DNA strands that went into the ASO is, of course, me and Iman thinking about, wait a second, so in IT management, they kind of went through the revolution. They have this, they throw away these things like DevOps and, of course, at Google SRE, and it clearly have shifted a lot of IT operation tasks into the essentially development and coding tasks. And there's a lot of research built including by us in the theyre report, which sort of studies how DevOps functions in the real world. And we were realizing that a lot of IT practices in the modern environments are kind of light years ahead of security practices. And so we are trying to, the other part of, big part of DNA of ASO is us trying to reverse engineer the successes of the IT teams and kind of implant them in the security operations. To me, the similarities are kind of uncanny, and sometimes you talk to what the system administrators did in the, 1990s. I keep referring to the 1990s for some reason, and then figure out, wait a second, SOC analysts do it in 2020s. And that's I don't lose sleep over that, but that's what keeps me up at night from excitement, not from, being scared.
Yeah, and if you look at like DevOps and SRE and a lot of these practices and principles, it wasn't that we got a bunch of prod support, IT support folks to then go and learn how to code and do software engineering. It was we figured out a model for everyone's work to sort of be homogenized, right? Not even be homogenized, but be on the same type of CI/CD pipeline, right? Now everyone understands how their work contributes to the overall performance, and those outcomes were exactly outlined here, right? So culture and work environment, improved organizational performance, improved software delivery and operational performance, less burnout, less deployment pain, less rework. Like
let's use that in SOC. Anybody SOC can use these and kind of like as motivational. Yes, but how do you make it practical?
Yeah, like cut and paste those challenges and let's apply it to security operations. Do you think that would really change the state of affairs that we operate SecOps practices in today? So that leads us to this one big point, which is every year you can go to RSA, you can buy a new SIM year after year after year, and I've talked to customers who have told me that they've went through 4 SIMs in the past 6 years, and I'm like, how did you even make the case to hire this team to manage 4 different SIMs and actually prove value out of this over the course? Anyways.
Well, the second was way better than the first, and guess what? Third was just much better, and the fourth, that was the real winner.
And then the fourth one was building it themselves while they're running. Yeah, totally. So one of the big things we're realizing is the thing that that really changed the world in the software development, software deployment world is there's a big culture around DevOps and SRE. Like people love their work. People feel like they're contributing to the greater good of their organization. The development velocity has gone up. New products are being developed. Like all these amazing things that developers get to be a part of. But in security, people are just quite frankly like they're burnt out. They're struggling to understand how their work contributes to all of the greater good of the organization, and also not just how their work contributes, but how their work can help their own performance and help them grow in their roles. So we need to build this idea of an engineering discipline that SecOps teams and SOC teams can align to, so people have a purpose of how they do their work, how they approach all the different tools in their environment, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's actually get into an overview of what ASO is and some of how this is really grounded in.
And this is kind of Iman's favorite slide, so an hour later he may still be talking about this. But this is the slide that also contains the actual 10x element that you'd get to, because the point is that we named our first ASO paper 10x your SOC, and a lot of people kind of came at our door and said, you're lying. You cannot possibly make SOC 10 times better. I know how to make it 10% better, maybe 10% every few years, but 10x is clearly a lie. Well, the thing is, it's not.
Yeah, Anton had some Twitter followers that were like going at him when the paper came out.
They think marketing wrote it, but it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly, it wasn't. Yeah, and also like when people think of the word autonomic, blame Phil for this. By the way, if you see Phil, just blame Phil for this. They're like, people have been talking about the autonomous SOC for years. That's a bunch of marketing fluff. But if you dive into the paper, we actually talk about this idea of like how the SOC can actually become an ingrained, self-sustaining element of the organization, which is what DevOps teams are. If a company wants to acquire a new company, build a new product, the board is never like, oh, is our DevOps team going to be able to keep up with this change, right? But they are concerned about the security operations team. So that's where a lot of it comes from. Okay, so this data right here is actually really important. This is actually Google's journey towards an SRE-oriented DNR program. And actually, if you see the documentary that just came out on YouTube, that's a pretty good one. That's the team that we're referring to here. This is just very, very high level data. None of the metrics are here, but you can see the trend lines. And what you're seeing is the blue is automation, efficiency, what I call efficiency. The red is work that requires manual involvement. And the green is the unit cost to doing the work, okay? And we also, like most companies we talked to today that are in where we were in 2015 or 2016, basically had a lot of manual work to do, and it costed a lot of time, it costed a lot of technology costs. Like it just generally costs a lot to do DNR when your work is basically manual. And where we've gone in the last several years, we've grown 30x in terms of how much data we consume. We acquired Fitbit, we have, cloud grew a ton, YouTube grew a ton. Now there's like 20 ads each video and not just 2, right? So you can imagine all this data that we have, we've grown and scaled to, and this team had to basically support the entire Alphabet estate. And they would have never been able to support the entire Alphabet estate had they not invested in these SRE-like approaches to building scalable solutions to security operations challenges, to where in 2022, we have a 90% level of automation across all the data that we support. And this last 10% of data is actually really important. Because ideally where you want to get to is this place where you can say, my security operations team is proactively managing the threats that my organization faces, right? But how can you proactively manage the threats if you're trying to juggle a lot of work that is, ends up being, 90% false positives, right? So this last 10% of work is interesting because now we get to say that our security operations team is fully utilized towards a small subset of the greater work that we have in place. And we also have clear metrics on the true positives of this last 10%. And so if I say that 80% of that last 10% of work ends up being true positives, we get to say that our team is utilized towards 80% of actual security threats. I have a proactive security team in place. So it's really important for you to understand, like, the investment in automation is not just an investment in something sexy that people talk about, in the news, and there's new products in the space. It's actually a change in how we approach problems from our people and how we encourage people to think about solving problems so that a couple of years from now, my organization is growing in a sustainable, healthy manner, and we're also able to manage risk very effectively because our people have time to focus on value-added work. Things like, spending time doing, operationalizing TI, spending time doing more proactive threat hunting, or delivering value outside of the SOC, i.e., the folks closest to the attackers need to have a bit more influence on the direction of the business, and they're not going to get there if they're flooded with threats and incidents all day. So that is the idea of being in an autonomic state of existence.
Yeah. And to me, a lot of the actual human work is not about getting humans out. And this is like what I've seen some of the vendors where they say, oh, we're going to automate your SOC. Of course, we think it's completely crazy, even though we are talking about autonomic security. The human, we don't ever expect the human part to shrink to zero. It's like a painfully obvious statement, but I want to say it just to say that it's not about replacing analysts with code. It's kind of about super diligently shift all the machinable stuff to machines, and they have people build those machines, right? Like to go kind of a little behind.
Yeah, let security people do security, because that's why they want to enter these jobs. They want to be able to focus their time on things that matter. And when they spend, all their weeks on a case, and it turns out the case was just a false positive, it leads to a decrease in job morale. So how do we actually know that they're happy? This is a fun one. Well, I know that they're happy because if I go to any security engineer's calendar in our internal org, what we see is we see a lot of time. And this isn't time, this isn't just free time, okay? This isn't time that's not on their calendar because they're just chilling, eating Cheetos. It's time that they're spending solving complex security problems for the organization. And most analysts' calendars don't have this much time to actually be creative and think about how to solve complex challenges for their organizations. So that's the one funny thing. The average tenure of our team, we see folks that have been here for 17 years, 9 years, 7 years, right? People are happy when they're at a company for a long time. And then the funniest part to me is the job titles. We've got the funniest. My favorite one is the cyber insurance claims adjuster. Some of these people may actually be here, by the way. So yeah.
And they may be here on video. Maybe the Duchess of Cyberspace, I'm pretty sure is.
Okay. So a lot of this is rooted in, okay, great, ASO as a vision is amazing, but how? How do we actually get to this place where I can go from a SOC that may be a legacy SOC and shift to a more agile working fashion? We have a couple slides we're going to go through that really break down this, but it's rooted in this framework we call CDCR.
Which is not us saying run faster, because this is avoiding the whole run faster angle. It's more about the feedback, and maybe that's what we'll end up talking about.
Exactly, because if you look at the core pillars of this, the first three kind of seem similar to a legacy SOC. You need visibility, you have to be able to derive analytics from that visibility, and you need to be able to know how to respond to those analytics, right? The introduction of the continuous feedback loop is really the big important thing, because the idea of continuous feedback in DevOps really introduced this model where everyone thinks about their work as not I've closed a case and I go on to the next one, but that in how do I solve a problem to make sure that the person before me and the person after me is all integrated and all of our work is aligned, okay? And the continuous feedback piece is important because this is where the idea of what some high-performing security operations practices or MSPs even do, which is they have use case libraries that they use to stitch everyone's work together, right? Kind of like the Palantir ADS framework. It's a good framework for you to understand how everyone in your SOC sort of operates on the same types of use cases, and all that human encoding is captured. So when there's incidents, people need to roll off, people get promoted, people quit their jobs, so whatever, all that knowledge is continually tracked. And then the business intelligence piece is this idea of what I said earlier, the people closest to the attackers, the people that understand which TTPs their adversaries are using across your organization, which environments are being affected. These folks, in my opinion, need to have a lot more influence with the development side of the business. But unfortunately, a lot of SOCs are sitting in their own silo, and exactly, right? Anton, you got anything out of this one?
No, we should probably go further. There's fun stuff to share as well.
Yeah. Before this session, Anton and I were how do we keep a track of time to make sure we're not going too fast or too slow?
Yeah, because we're not having a 2-day workshop, and this is 1 hour 1, by the way, Iman, just as a reminder. So we wanted to get to some of the frameworks, but I want to spend very brief time on principles. And while this sounds kind of hand-wavy, a lot of this, as Iman reminded everybody about the culture and changes at the kind of a fundamental level, not tell your SOC analyst to code. That won't fly. And I think that from the principles we highlighted, and on the right side might be kind of the negative principles, I want to start there because a lot of people who heard early versions of this or participated in workshops kind of trying to tell us that, wait a second, my SOC analyst cannot code, or I cannot hire all top-tier professionals like Google. So some of them are more like objections, and we learned while doing this that ultimately this isn't about that. It isn't about your talent is no good or you're not doing the right things. It's kind of about organizing and building structures, building patterns that lead to that. And if somebody says, well, and one of the ideas we would share is that you analysts and the SOC and engineers would work closely together, and eventually you may get to a state where analysts and engineers are the same people, like at Google, where there's no SOC analyst. In fact, there's no SOC. The point is that there's a line, and that line is driven by a principle that ultimately you are responsible for building detections, making sure they run, and dealing with the signals, and then of course you hand off to IR as an ultimate implementation of this. But the principles that drive this would be that manual work where you close cases is in SRE land called toil, and that's the toil that we kind of fight in this approach, because ultimately, I sometimes joke that you can't ops your way to SOC success, but you can dev your way to SOC success. You would always be behind. The assets and attackers would grow faster. As a quick side note, I lose my sleep more about the business and assets growth rather than about attackers changes. We sort of know that threat landscape change. I hate the term change in landscape because it's just called threat landscape. But businesses change and activities change and what people do change, and a SOC that worries me more. So sometimes this ends up with a lot of tactical things. I have to like whack them all, and that's the part that we are trying to eliminate pretty heavily. And silos, Iman already highlighted many times. The other item that we do spend a lot of time on is, of course, the metrics and SLOs. These are also like the language from the SRE land. It's mostly about what we measure and how we track success down this path. So it ends up being not measuring how quickly you close cases, by the way, as a reminder. This is my favorite SOC metric from my Gartner days, but measuring a lot of other things like the percentages of activities dealt by the machines. We spend a lot, we also stole the whole no heroes idea from the SRE folks, because ultimately, in my analyst days, I used to say, does this process pass the bus test? If the guy gets hit by a bus, do you still have a capability? And the no here, the more polite, more googly way of saying
Win
that.
the lottery, not hit by a bus.
Don't. Well, if we're hit by a bus, then maybe the whole thing would not fail. At this point, we have more fans, but yeah, that's a risk. And then these principles ultimately drive the machinery that we'll share today.
Yeah. Your mic keeps clipping. And I'm like, are they testing to see if your voice travels across the whole room? Anton, when I first met him, it was funny because I was like, I didn't know what to expect. Is he tall? Is he short? Like, what is he? And he comes out with this giant Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wingspan. Anyways. So, all right, sounds great, but it sounds difficult. So how do we get started with this type of framework, CDCR, so on and so forth? And actually, shout out to Steve, who's in the back of the room there. He just joined the ASO team, and he's one of the brains behind a lot of this, just breaking down this framework into actual working structures, because he used to run a team worldwide at Accenture and many other organizations. So, okay, this is basically, okay, most of the companies that want to do this, if you think of a company like Netflix or Facebook, or let's just take Netflix, for example, they have one of the best security engineering teams in the world, but they also only manage Netflix, right? Now, you take a company like Disney that's 30 different companies at once, acquisitions, everything else, all that tech debt that has come on. It's a lot more difficult to say, we're going to shift all of our security ops teams to be more like engineers. So this framework is a framework to basically take your legacy SOC roles and shift people into skills-based, functions, right? That's centered around a couple things, right? Log collection engineering, detection engineering, the traditional security analyst type work, CTI, and then a new role which is called automation engineering, right? And we think of this, all these things on the side, these are kind of like the jobs that need to be done, right? So everyone understands what the core functions that they have to provide to their organization are. And also, like, how do we take these core functions now and how do we map them into work queues? So that people understand, again, that cohesion between what I'm supposed to do and the output of my work on the greater team, so that all of our work is sort of stitched together in this same sort of continuous feedback loop, right? And this all kind of comes together in this idea that we call, this is the use case library, which isn't new. Like people have done this, but your use case library should take into account the business context, asset, threat context, vulnerability context, all the things that you have to all the contextual understanding of the threats that you have to manage. And then in the use case library, again, similar to like the Palantir ADS framework, right? Your hypothesis, the research you've done, the analytics you create, the playbooks you use to respond, and the way it's actually measured in the field, the analytics and the playbooks, All of that work should all be stitched together on a sort of like a single playing field so that everyone's job has one way to map to everyone else's work. So from the onset of like doing your hypothesis on like which logs you need to ingest, or using frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK to start to build out your, which data sources you need to ingest, so on and so forth, to like any of the research that's done in the field or the CTI that's consumed, so on and so forth. All of this gets mapped together, and it gives you a model for you to be able to measure basically the efficacy of your security operations program. Because now you have work that you get to basically take all these heterogeneous roles in your SOC, stitch everyone together in this continuous feedback model, and then you also capture human encoding in the use cases. So when someone drops off, or there's an incident overnight, or whatever happens, like everyone is able to get fully ramped up to speed, at any point in time, throughout the life cycle of a security operations practice. And the other idea, like we have other examples we talk to customers about, which is this is like the outbound security.
It's the non-annoying shift left, by the way. We don't, that's a disclaimer. I guess it's a technical term at this point.
Yeah.
We're not trying to fix it in code and you won't have any security operations challenges. Like, we're not going there. This is not going to happen.
Yeah, this is the shift left out of the SOC idea. Basically, the idea is, y'all heard of like outbound product managers, right? People that their job is just to take their products and go evangelize it outbound with customers. This is kind of like an outbound security analyst, right? It's going to be really hard for you to get everyone in your SOC to suddenly go and start interfacing with your development teams and the security champions and so on and so forth. Like, it's A, going to be unreasonable, B, like there's so much work to do in your SOC. So maybe just try standing up, one role for, a senior analyst who can interface with all these different functions of your team to also basically shift this knowledge upstream to the security champions that work on the dev teams, so that you can provide more actionable insight to to drive better developer hygiene. Because security operations is, even if we talk about proactive security operations, it's still kind of reactive, right? Like, proactive actually happens with preventative controls, how we build and secure all of our applications and our infrastructure by default. So the only way to truly get proactive is get into this place where we can drive this knowledge out of the things we're seeing in the field upstream into the business, and that's sort of this idea of like implementing a continuous feedback loop there.
And of course, Iman's original title for this was SOC running influence operations on the rest of the org, but I think it got toned down to this. However, there are some solid examples where we look at a client SOC and they spend, 40% of time dealing with phishing, but it's almost like if SOC or somebody else in security leadership can influence how phishing is handled, for example, a reliable MFA, and some other examples, then that 40% may be gone. So the point is that I almost just 2x the SOC without changing anything in the SOC, just by running, kind of a change, making changes elsewhere. So to me, this was kind of a juicy example that I've seen happen. And I'm not going to joke that it's easy, but it's also much easier than just running 2 times faster. If you're trying to say, I'm going to respond to phishing at 2x speed. There's no real control for that, but making sure that some of the stuff is gone is a lot easier. So that's sort of an example of that.
Yeah, and it also gives a mechanism for your security operations team's work to get operationalized across your business, and for people to feel a bit more fulfilled because their work is actually going somewhere. A lot of times we get involved in these incidents and then we respond, it's just like, great job, everyone, all right, back at it, right? But having this type of function allows people whose work is then captured and shifted into the organization to feel good about what they're contributing to their work. And again, that's one of those drivers that helps motivate everyone that works in your security operations practice. How do we make sure that we're investing in all of the people in our practice so that people feel fulfilled and that their work is leading to meaningful outcomes for my organization? Okay, Anton, so walk me through.
So we also have, so the next few slides come from a longer workshop. So what I would do is I would explain our framework that we use to actually make the change at customers. And I'm going to highlight maybe one item per element. And don't freak out. The point is that you can still use many of the elements. You can talk to us later. But this is not the point of like, oh, you're going to memorize all that. So we did split this into degree of change and kind of like the what are we changing? How are we changing, say, people, process, and tech? No surprises here. And when people look at the transformational level, that's probably not the destination where every org would end up. It's kind of where Google ended up, more or less, but it doesn't mean that you would all be there after you follow the easy 3-step process. No, that is not what I'm saying. However, I want to follow one thread through this slide, and the thread is, of course, analysts and engineers. If I am looking at a low, mid-maturity SOC, there may not be any engineers, or engineering is elsewhere, or it's a consultant who build the rules, and then the analysts deal with the consequences. Well, on the very opposite end of the spectrum, you have our model, well, our Google model, where there is no SOC analyst as such, and there are engineers who study the threats, create detections, follow up detections, and deal with some of the responses, and then hand off to IR if there's an incident. The idea is that this is the absolute fusion of analyst and engineer into one person. But there's also, how about your analysts and content developers have lunch once a month? There's a first step to everything, and to me, this type of try to figure out who is on the other side, where this content coming from, may be the step one of many. But the step last is this is the same person. And it's actually a happy person who isn't stressed with doing too much operations, but doing mostly dev. So to me, this is one of the threads. Of course, the other favorite point, I promised one, but this is the other one, is of course metrics. A lot of this would not happen unless it's measured to that. If people are kind of set targets to spend half of their time, 40% as we said in the beginning, on building things and only the remainder of the time dealing with stuff where humans have to get shovels and do shoveling manually. Without metrics, it would never change. You can't just tell people who are 110% busy, by the way, pick up some coding lessons. And again, not the way to go. But ultimately, that's the direction on the people side. You also had a great point about growing talent, which you sometimes make here, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the other thing. If you look at tenure for most security operations teams, tenure is really low. It's because people get burnt out. They also don't find expanded career opportunities, or they become heroes, and they're now the tier 3 IR person that we need to be in tier 3 IR, because if we lose them and we get breached, we don't have anyone to do tier 3 IR. That hero mentality, all these different things, they're compounding to all of the issues. And so, buying a new product isn't going to change your life. You're going to have to consider how you can really invest in your people, invest in your practices, invest in your technologies, so that you can really make the most out of them and drive this sort of 10x vision.
And people who were pulling hard drives out of machines during Opera in 2010 are still at Google, some of them. So it's a tenure, it's an example from the videos, but the idea is that people who dealt with operational response 10 years ago are still very happy security leaders, security operations leaders here. So this to me is kind of the very opposite example, where it points at long tenure. So on the protest slide, a lot of people, I had a kind of a sad slide somewhere, which kind of highlights the fact that if you just, get a hammer and beat your processes so they are more optimal and faster, there may not be enough beating to do to catch up with how the assets and threats change. So to me, this is why on the protest side, we do talk about improving things like improving alert triage, but ultimately we are heavily pushing many of the processes into machines. If there's a process for studying a piece of malicious code or extracting intelligence and writing rules out of this, a lot of this does get pushed to machines. So to me, the optimizing the processes only goes so far. You do need to push some of the stuff into machines. And it doesn't mean AI ML would do the work. The point is kind of more about the process framework that allows you to feed more and more to robots, because I think it's a scary metaphor from the actual book on DevOps, when they said that you don't want to build a system that you feed with humans. And that just stuck in my head as kind of a bloody metaphor, but ultimately a lot of SOCs are machines that are fed by humans. Mm-hmm. And we are advocating ultimately the opposite approach. For many companies, this would mean involving the SOC as one of the technologies, and of course, you may think it's because we sell SOAR, we are telling you this. But ultimately, SOAR is not a must. The must is that you have a machine that can implement processes. At Google, it isn't a SOAR. Clients, it is in fact a commercial.
Yeah, I guess the technology piece, which we'll actually talk about in a bit. And by the way, these frameworks that we're building, everything is a work in progress, because Anton and I, when we first created this, we were like, we need to build something that is vendor agnostic framework. And B, it allows people to sort of contribute to expand and grow the discipline and the practice, because the second you align it to being siloed to a single vendor, so on and so forth, then suddenly you lose the idea of evangelizing a framework that
Now I can talk and you can't. Great.
I lost my train of thought, but basically, building this in a vendor-agnostic fashion basically allows people to consider how they can contribute to the practice. So we're continuing to refine this. On the tech side, you mentioned something that I thought was interesting, which is, not everyone uses SOAR, or some people use SOAR. So SOAR is great because it allows people to do things that traditionally people might have to know Python and know how to code, so on and so forth, script. It allows people to do things without having to learn code. And this is the idea of like platform engineering, right? Like DevOps is great, but platform engineering is also equally as important. And this is why having technology vendors that you do trust, that do listen to that do have a vision for their products is super important, because platform engineering is also equally as important as the people journey. It's the idea of investing in your platform in a way that allows people to solve the challenges of toil, do more self-service workflows, all that sort of stuff. So like an example of this, and I hate to talk about our own products, but like Chronicle's like automated IOC matching, feature. It's a cool way of doing something that basically traditionally might have had to be manually stood up with other tools, but Chronicle does it by default, right? These are ways to continually eliminate toil within the products and stuff and get towards this idea of platform engineering with your vendor, but then also implementing sort of agile practices, with, we're off to technology, with your frameworks.
Perfect. And again, on the tech side, of course, this is where we get the closest to wearing, I guess, marketing salesy hats, because the theme is not so much about using our products, but the theme is about using the products that don't constrain you and don't become a drag. Again, in my Gartner days, I've met a lot of security teams that spend way too much time keeping the products up. And of course, I can name a whole bunch of SIEM products where most people spend time keeping them up rather than using them. To me, the push to SaaS backended products, cloud backended products, again, like Chronicle and like other software as a service products in this area, is kind of the unavoidable movement. And while we still see holdouts who say that, well, we prefer appliances, I mean, I do tell them that, hey, the 90s are mostly over. It's the 2022. But this to me is largely not, maybe it's subject to a debate, but it's not really, it's a debate that the other side won't win. And we would end up with the cloud backended products for most of the detection tasks. I mean, it's just like CrowdStrike and a few other EDR vendors changed that game. I think the SIEM game is being changed as well, and of course SOAR and a few others. So this to me is one of the threads here, is that you probably don't want to spend time maintaining database appliances.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think just to add to that, like, we talked about automation earlier. SOAR is not the only mechanism of automation, right? Because think about people that manage on-premise Splunk environments. They have to right size and scale VMs and manage the clusters, everything, right? Versus like if you go to a cloud native tool, you're kind of abstracted from all that. So now you have to take those resources and make better use with engineering resources that used to have to manage VMs. The more we can drive to this place of abstracting us away from non-security work and toil work into focusing on value-added security work, the better. And this is the whole reason why the cloud transformation is so successful with just customers in general, is because, think about data centers. Banks want to be banks these days, and hospitals want to be hospitals, right? No one wants to have to hire thousands of data center staff to build and manage and own all these racks and everything else. Consider the technologies you leverage internally. What could happen if you freed up the time that certain people spent dedicated, maybe multiple people dedicated towards owning a certain function of your technology, towards reinvesting that towards other capabilities, other jobs that need to be done in your organization. Okay, make it actionable. Go ahead.
Shockingly, we are mostly done. And if you want to see more details on this, I mean, there's still the original ASO paper that you can find. We've done a fair number of blogs. For example, there's a really juicy blog on toil where we try to make it into usable toil elimination effort. We did a couple of podcasts, including with Google team members that deal with detection and response, where they kind of explain
In one of them, they explain their aversion to using the word SOC at Google, which is kind of a fun story. So to me, this is kind of the stuff to learn more, and we do workshops for clients, which is kind of a separate story. We are not advertising this, otherwise we'd be at capacity or above that. The other point I wanted to highlight is, for a lot of security technologists, including myself, the whole culture change is scary. And when I hear culture change, I just want to outsource it to somebody and not because I want to go tune my SIM or do other stuff. So to me, this is the part where we sort of almost insist that you go there.
Yeah. So.
I hand off the mic to Iman because
So, I mean, the TLDR is this. This type of journey takes an investment of time on your end to consider how you can drive this type of change across your organizations. So it is a big uplift. Like, I can't tell you, just pay Google or pay someone and you're all good. No, it is a big uplift because you have to consider from your C-suite downwards to your ICs how you can cultivate this type of journey. And it's something that's really exciting for so many customers we're talking to. They're so excited to be a part of something fresh, something exciting, and also to contribute back to this work. And the last slide I'm just going to skip through because we had a section on community initiatives. Speaking of contributions, we're part of the MITRE CTIDs, so we've done a couple R&D initiatives that we're contributing in the space, blah, blah, blah. But the last slide I want to get to was, so when I first met Anton and we started to get along really well, I was like, this is cool, man. I was like, you're like Batman and I'm like Robin. But lately I'm feeling more like Batman now. No, follow me on Twitter. Don't follow Anton. He has too many followers.
So we're like Batman and Batman.
Yeah, we're like Batman and Batman, exactly. Evil Batman and like good Batman. We'll be here in the room if anyone wants to chat one-on-one, ask any questions. Sorry we didn't have time for Q&A, but we'll stick around for a bit to connect with folks, and hope you enjoyed this session.